My entire family skipped my med school graduation to celebrate my sister's engagement, and I realized for the first time who they really cared about. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I am Lena Parker, 25, and I just finished med school, the first in my family. I had dreamed of this day for years, studying late nights, working part-time jobs, and sacrificing everything. I thought my family would be proud, but I was wrong. My older sister, Mara Parker, 27, had always been the favorite. She never worked as hard as I did, yet my parents showered her with praise. On graduation day, I waited, hoping to see my family cheering me on. But no one came. Later, I learned they were all at Mara's engagement party. I felt invisible, hurt, and betrayed. I tried calling them, but my parents brushed it off. Mara didn't even seem sorry. That's when I realized I couldn't rely on them for validation. I decided to focus on myself. I threw myself into my residency, earning respect from doctors, patients, and colleagues. Meanwhile, Mara relied on my parents' approval, unaware of how I was quietly building my own path. Months later, at a family gathering, I walked in confident, sharing my achievements without arrogance. My success shone, and for the first time, my parents and Mara truly saw me. They realized I didn't need their approval, and Mara couldn't overshadow me anymore. I learned something important: sometimes the people who skip your victories reveal who truly matters. And rising without them is the sweetest revenge. If you want, I can also make a punchy, YouTube-friendly version under 200 words that hooks viewers even more tightly at the start. Do you want me to do that? Before graduation, my life had been full of sacrifices. I spent countless nights in the library, pushing myself past exhaustion to understand every detail of medicine. While other kids went on family vacations or spent weekends relaxing, I stayed home, studying. I worked at a cafe and tutored students to cover my tuition. Every penny I earned was hard-earned, and I thought it would make my family proud. Mara, on the other hand, seemed to glide through life. People were drawn to her charm and confidence. She could walk into a room and immediately grab attention without trying. She never worried about grades or money, yet somehow everything seemed to fall into her hands. I watched her receive praise and gifts while my own accomplishments barely earned a nod. My parents often made it worse. They compared me to her constantly, saying things like, "Why can't you be more like Mara?" or "She handles everything so well, you could learn a thing or two." It didn't matter how much I struggled or how late I stayed up studying. In their eyes, Mara's effortless charm always outweighed my hard work. Even family gatherings became a stage where Mara shined, and I felt like a shadow. I tried to speak up, to show my dedication and determination, but it rarely mattered. Every success I achieved was downplayed, and every mistake, no matter how small, was magnified. Living under this constant comparison and favoritism shaped me, building a quiet strength inside me. I realized early on that I couldn't rely on their recognition. I had to prove my worth for myself, not for anyone else. That feeling of being overlooked planted the first seeds of determination, and eventually, the resolve to take control of my own path. The morning of my graduation, I felt a rush of excitement I had never experienced before. I carefully put on my gown and cap, making sure everything was perfect. The air buzzed with energy as fellow students and their families filled the hall. I imagined my parents' proud faces, cheering for me, smiling through tears. I searched the crowd, hoping to spot them. But as the minutes passed, their absence became impossible to ignore. My stomach sank. My heart ached with confusion. I kept thinking they might be running late, that any moment they would appear. Finally, I spotted my cousin, Emily, waving at me from the back. Relief hit for a second until I noticed her expression. "Lena. I'm so sorry," she whispered. "They didn't come. Everyone went to Mara's engagement party instead." I froze, disbelief mixing with shock. My body felt heavy, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Mara's engagement mattered more to them than the day I had worked for my entire life. I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me, sharper than I could have imagined. Anger bubbled inside me, hot and bitter. How could they choose a party over the milestone that defined years of sacrifice, sweat, and sleepless nights? At the same time, my chest tightened with heartbreak. I had imagined this moment with them by my side, celebrating the culmination of my struggles, sharing in my joy. Instead, I was alone among strangers, while the people who were supposed to care most were somewhere else, celebrating someone else. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to focus. Tears burned my eyes, but I clenched my fists and straightened my shoulders. I promised myself I wouldn't let this moment break me. If anything, this betrayal would fuel me to rise even higher. The morning of my graduation, I felt a rush of excitement I had never experienced before. I carefully put on my gown and cap, making sure everything was perfect. The air buzzed with energy as fellow students and their families filled the hall. I imagined my parents' proud faces, cheering for me, smiling through tears. I searched the crowd, hoping to spot them. But as the minutes passed, their absence became impossible to ignore. My stomach sank. My heart ached with confusion. I kept thinking they might be running late, that any moment they would appear. Finally, I spotted my cousin, Emily, waving at me from the back. Relief hit for a second until I noticed her expression. "Lena. I'm so sorry," she whispered. "They didn't come. Everyone went to Mara's engagement party instead." I froze, disbelief mixing with shock. My body felt heavy, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Mara's engagement mattered more to them than the day I had worked for my entire life. I felt a wave of betrayal wash over me, sharper than I could have imagined. Anger bubbled inside me, hot and bitter. How could they choose a party over the milestone that defined years of sacrifice, sweat, and sleepless nights? At the same time, my chest tightened with heartbreak. I had imagined this moment with them by my side, celebrating the culmination of my struggles, sharing in my joy. Instead, I was alone among strangers, while the people who were supposed to care most were somewhere else, celebrating someone else. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to focus. Tears burned my eyes, but I clenched my fists and straightened my shoulders. I promised myself I wouldn't let this moment break me. If anything, this betrayal would fuel me to rise even higher. I couldn't shake the sting of what had happened, so I decided to reach out. My hands trembled as I dialed my parents' number, hoping for an explanation, maybe even an apology. When they answered, their tone was light, almost casual, as if nothing had occurred. "Lena, it's just an engagement," my mom said. "Don't make such a big deal out of it." I felt my chest tighten. But this was my graduation. I worked so hard for this. "You didn't even try to come," I said, my voice cracking. They brushed it off, insisting that Mara's party was more important. No recognition for the years I had poured into my studies, no acknowledgement of my sacrifices. Their words were like a wall between us, cold and unyielding. I hung up and called Mara next, hoping at least she would show some care. When she answered, she sounded cheerful, completely unfazed by my hurt. "Oh, Lena, it's fine," she said casually. "You know everyone wanted to celebrate me today. Don't take it personally." Her indifference cut deeper than I expected. She didn't apologize. She didn't seem to regret taking the attention that should have been mine. Instead, she acted as if I didn't even matter. I felt a wave of humiliation, sitting alone in my room with the phone still in my hand. The family I had hoped would cheer me on treated my biggest achievement like it was nothing. In that moment, I felt invisible, like all the hard work, the late nights, and the struggles I endured had been erased in favor of Mara's celebration. The sting of their actions burned, but beneath it all, a small spark began to grow. If they couldn't value me, I would make sure I proved my worth in ways they couldn't ignore. After those calls, something inside me shifted. I sat quietly in my apartment, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time, I saw my situation clearly. I had spent years hoping my family would notice my efforts, praise my progress, or stand beside me during important moments. But they had shown me, again and again, that their attention flowed in only one direction. I realized I couldn't continue chasing approval that was never meant for me. I refused to let their neglect shape my future any longer. Instead of waiting for their support, I promised myself that I would build a life grounded in my own strength. I wouldn't beg for respect, affection, or acknowledgement. If they couldn't offer it willingly, I would stop looking for it. As I sat with these thoughts, a new determination grew. I knew I needed to rise above their behavior, but I also understood that I didn't have to pretend their actions had no impact. I could use this pain, not as something to break me, but as fuel to stand taller. Slowly, an idea formed, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I didn't want to harm anyone or cross any lines, yet I wanted them to feel what it meant to overlook someone who had worked tirelessly. I thought about ways to show my independence, to let them see what life looked like when I stopped carrying the weight of their expectations. It wasn't a plan for revenge in the traditional sense. It was more about shifting the balance, letting actions speak louder than arguments. If they ever realized what they had lost, it would be because I had created something strong and unshakable without them. With that promise to myself, I stood up, ready to move forward on my own terms. A few weeks later, I began my residency at Riverside Medical Center, a hospital known for its high standards. The halls were filled with talented doctors and nurses, and the work was demanding, but I felt alive. Each patient I treated, each procedure I assisted with, gave me a sense of purpose that my family had never offered. Slowly, I started earning respect. My supervisors noticed my dedication, my peers sought my advice, and patients expressed gratitude that warmed my heart. I was no longer just Mara's sister or the overlooked child. I was someone whose abilities mattered, whose decisions could save lives, whose presence was valued. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on Mara through mutual friends and family updates. She had moved into a new apartment with her fiancé and continued to enjoy a life cushioned by our parents' support. She hosted parties, wore designer clothes, and thrived on attention, but there was little substance behind it. Her accomplishments were surface level, her achievements mostly inherited or given. I couldn't help but notice the contrast between her life and mine. As my skills grew and I gained confidence, I realized how much power I had quietly accumulated. The independence I had fought so hard for became more tangible every day. I no longer needed anyone to validate me, and I could see how my growing presence might shift family dynamics. A quiet determination took root. If I had previously felt invisible, that would no longer be the case. I would show them what it meant to succeed through effort, discipline, and perseverance. Without confrontation or anger, my life itself would become a statement, one that Mara and my parents couldn't ignore. For the first time, I felt not just capable, but unstoppable. One afternoon, during a quiet break at the hospital, I received a call from my aunt. She often shared bits of family news, and this time her voice carried something that instantly caught my attention. She mentioned that my parents were preparing to transfer a significant piece of property to Mara as part of her future plans. Along with it came several financial benefits that had never been offered to me. I listened silently, but inside, something sharpened. It wasn't the property itself that struck me, it was the pattern. Once again, everything valuable was being handed to her without effort, while I had always been expected to manage on my own. Later that evening, I sat down with a clear mind and went through the information my aunt had shared. I realized the arrangement wasn't as secure as my parents thought. There were gaps in how the documents had been prepared, areas where decisions were still flexible, and details that required further signatures and verification. Without rushing, I began mapping out a plan, not one rooted in anger, but in balance. If my parents insisted on overlooking me, then I would simply use the openings in their own process to shift things in a more equal direction. I consulted a trusted advisor at the hospital who understood estate matters well. They guided me on how to legally and ethically ensure that my name entered the conversation where it had been missing for years. I wasn't trying to take anything that wasn't mine. My goal was simple: if my family insisted on denying my worth, then I would show them I wasn't the quiet, forgotten daughter anymore. My steps were deliberate, careful, and entirely within the rules. This time, they wouldn't be able to ignore me. The evening of the family dinner, I stepped into the dining room feeling completely different than I had in the past. My posture was straight, my steps deliberate, and my presence impossible to overlook. I had spent years learning to carry myself with quiet authority, and tonight that confidence shone naturally. Everyone was gathered, chatting about ordinary things, but when I entered, conversations paused. Mara glanced at me with a flicker of surprise, while my parents offered polite smiles that felt uneasy. I took my seat and allowed a small, controlled smile, letting them see that I had grown into someone they could no longer dismiss. Throughout the dinner, I spoke thoughtfully about my work, dropping subtle hints about recent cases I had handled and the responsibilities I had taken on at the hospital. I didn't boast, but my words carried weight, and my calm self-assurance filled the room. I shared moments from my life that highlighted my independence and the challenges I had overcome without asking anyone for help. As the evening continued, I noticed a shift. My parents exchanged glances, and Mara's cheerful demeanor faltered slightly. It was clear they were processing what they had overlooked for so many years. The guilt was almost tangible, and an undercurrent of envy quietly appeared as they realized my achievements were real, significant, and entirely earned. By the time dessert arrived, I could feel the balance subtly tipping. The room no longer had the same casual superiority it once held over me. For the first time, they were seeing me not just as the younger sister or a quiet shadow, but as someone who had carved her own path and earned her own respect. That night, silence carried more meaning than words, and I understood that my presence alone was already changing the way they viewed me. A few weeks after the family dinner, I quietly took steps that would shift the balance in my favor. Using the gaps I had discovered earlier in the property and family arrangements, I arranged meetings with the legal advisors handling our inheritance. I asked careful questions, reviewed the documents thoroughly, and positioned myself to claim a portion that had never been considered for me before. Every action was calculated, precise, and completely within the rules. Meanwhile, Mara was planning her engagement party, expecting all attention to revolve around her as usual. On the night of the celebration, I attended, calm and composed, carrying a subtle aura of success. Friends and distant relatives whispered compliments about my recent accomplishments and my growing reputation in the hospital. My presence alone drew admiration, overshadowing the party's original focus. I watched Mara's smile falter as she noticed the shift. The chatter that had surrounded her began to gravitate toward me. Guests expressed genuine interest in my work, my residency experiences, and my independence. For the first time, the spotlight was no longer hers by default. Even my parents couldn't escape the change. Their pride in Mara had been obvious for so long, but now they were confronted with admiration directed at me, and it was difficult to ignore. Neighbors and family friends praised my accomplishments, sometimes directly comparing my dedication to Mara's more carefree approach. The embarrassment was subtle but undeniable, and I could see them processing it quietly. It wasn't revenge and anger, it was a gentle but firm demonstration that ignoring me had consequences. I had proven my worth without confrontation, simply by stepping into my power and allowing others to recognize it. That night, I realized I had begun to reclaim not only respect but the acknowledgement I had been denied for years. A few days after the engagement party, I invited my family to a casual lunch under the guise of catching up. I arrived with confidence, carrying myself with a quiet authority that had been missing for years. My goal was not to confront or accuse, but to let my life speak for itself. As we sat down, I shared stories from my residency, detailing experiences that had challenged me and shaped my skills. I talked about patients I had helped, procedures I had mastered, and the responsibilities I had earned. I spoke naturally, without arrogance, but every word revealed how far I had come on my own. Mara listened, her smile faltering as she absorbed the extent of my independence. The confidence I radiated contrasted sharply with her own reliance on our parents' favor. She shifted in her seat, a subtle tension growing as she realized I no longer depended on anyone's validation to feel accomplished. My parents, too, were silent, their eyes wide as they registered my growth. The daughter they had underestimated for years was no longer the quiet, overlooked girl. She had become someone capable, respected, and recognized outside the family circle. The pride they had reserved for Mara was now complicated by the undeniable reality of my achievements. I could see the change in their expressions: surprise, hesitation, and a trace of guilt. Without raising my voice or demanding acknowledgement, I had shifted the family dynamic. For the first time, they truly saw me, not as the younger sibling or a shadow, but as an independent woman who had built her own life. By the end of lunch, a silent understanding had formed. Mara looked uneasy, and my parents' admiration was tinged with regret. I had shown them that I no longer needed their approval to thrive, and the realization was more powerful than any argument I could have made. After the family gathering, I made a conscious choice to create boundaries. I no longer immersed myself in arguments or tried to earn attention that was never willingly given. Instead, I interacted with my family politely but kept my distance from the old patterns of favoritism and comparison. I realized I could care for them without allowing their behavior to affect my peace or self-worth. Focusing on my career and personal growth brought a deep sense of fulfillment. I started receiving invitations from colleagues to collaborate on projects, and patients praised my dedication. Recognition now came from people who valued effort and ability, not blood ties or biased preferences. That acknowledgement, earned honestly and fairly, felt far more satisfying than anything I had sought from my family. Mara, on the other hand, began to show signs of frustration. Without my parents' constant reinforcement and the effortless spotlight she had always enjoyed, she seemed unsettled. Friends and relatives occasionally commented on my progress, sometimes in subtle comparison, and she realized that she could no longer dominate attention by default. The self-centered path she had taken came with unexpected consequences. Despite this, I felt no bitterness toward her. I understood that everyone faces the results of their choices. I had simply learned to step aside from unhealthy expectations, focus on what I could control, and let life unfold. By the end of that year, I felt a calm satisfaction. I had achieved recognition on my own terms and built a life anchored in independence, resilience, and respect. Mara's struggles were a quiet reminder of the cost of relying solely on others for validation. And in that balance, I finally experienced a freedom I had long been denied, one that no favoritism or neglect could ever take away. Sitting in my apartment one evening, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, the long years of effort, the moments of disappointment, and the times I had felt invisible in my own family. The betrayal had stung deeply, but looking back now, I could see how it had shaped me. Each hurt, each overlooked achievement, had forced me to develop resilience, determination, and self-reliance. Pain had become the engine of my growth. I realized that the absence of support from certain people didn't diminish my accomplishments. Instead, it highlighted the strength I had cultivated on my own. Mara and my parents had their own paths, but they were no longer in control of my happiness or validation. I had built a life where my worth was undeniable, recognized by people who mattered in meaningful ways. The lessons were clear and unforgettable. Sometimes, the people who skip your victories, who ignore your hard work, reveal exactly who truly values you. And while it hurts in the moment, their absence can become a powerful catalyst. You discover your own abilities, your own power, and your own voice. I carry this truth with me every day. It's possible to rise without anyone's approval, to achieve fulfillment without needing validation from those who fail to see your value. The journey is challenging, but it is also freeing, empowering, and deeply rewarding. As I look toward the future, I feel hopeful and strong. I know now that my success is mine alone, and no favoritism, neglect, or envy can take it away. If my story teaches anything, it's that triumph can grow from pain, and independence can flourish when recognition is denied. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones you claim for yourself, and in that, there is a joy and freedom that no one can ever take away. Do you think I handled my family the right way by stepping back, or should I have tried to forgive them sooner? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this.